I always thought my family was ordinary. Sure, we had our quirks, who doesn't? But nothing about a screamed mystery-solved drama. That changed last year when my siblings and I were tasked with cleaning out our grandparents' old house after they both passed away. My grandfather, Robert, had died almost 10 years earlier, and my grandmother, Ellen, had lived alone in the house ever since. When she passed, my mom and her siblings couldn't bring themselves to go through their parents' belongings, so they handed the job to us, the next generation. The house was a time capsule. My grandparents had lived there for over 50 years, and it seemed like they hadn't thrown anything away. The attic was packed with boxes, old furniture, and random knickknacks that smelled of dust and mothballs. On the second day of cleaning, I stumbled upon an old wooden desk in the corner of the attic. It was covered in cobwebs, and the drawers were jammed shut. I decided to pry one open, mostly out of curiosity. Inside, I found an envelope addressed to my grandfather. The envelope was yellowed with age, and the handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar. There was no return address, only a postmark dated May 12, 1959. That struck me as odd. This letter had been sitting here for over 60 years. I hesitated before opening it. Part of me felt like I was invading my grandfather's privacy, but the other part couldn't resist. Carefully, I unfolded the letter inside. The contents were strange. It wasn't a typical letter. There were no greetings, no sign-offs, just a short, cryptic message written in the same neat handwriting, *Robert, I know what you did. The truth will come out eventually. You can't bury the past forever. That was it. No explanation, no context. Just those ominous words. I showed the letter to my siblings, and we were all baffled. What do you think it means? My younger sister, Hannah, asked. I have no idea, I admitted. We decided to keep the letter to ourselves for the time being. My mom and her siblings were already emotional about sorting through the house. The last thing we needed was to add a mysterious, decades-old accusation into the mix. But I couldn't let it go. That night, I took the letter home and started digging. I searched through online archives, old newspapers, anything that might give me a clue about what this could be referencing. Weeks went by with no progress, and I was starting to think the letter was just some weird misunderstanding or even a prank. Then, I found something. While searching through an old newspaper database, I came across an article from 1958 about a local man named Richard Collins who had gone missing. He was last seen in the same small town where my grandparents lived, and the disappearance was never solved. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was it possible the letter was connected to this? My grandfather had never mentioned anyone named Richard Collins, but the timing and location were too coincidental to ignore. The more I researched, the stranger the story became. Richard Collins wasn't just a random local, he had been a close friend of my grandfather's. They worked together at a factory and were reportedly inseparable. Then, one day, Richard vanished without a trace. The article mentioned that my grandfather had been questioned by the police but was never considered a suspect. At the time, everyone assumed Richard had run away or met with an accident, but no evidence was ever found. I decided to confront my mom about it. One evening, I showed her the letter and told her everything I had discovered. Her reaction surprised me. She didn't seem shocked or confused. Instead, she looked uncomfortable. I think you should let this go, she said after a long pause. Why? I pressed. Because digging up the past doesn't help anyone, she replied. Her evasiveness only made me more determined. If my mom knew something and wasn't telling me, I needed to find out on my own. I went back to the house and started searching through every box, drawer, and cabinet for clues. Finally, in a locked trunk in the basement, I found what I was looking for, an old journal belonging to my grandfather. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about work, family life, and the occasional fishing trip. But buried in the middle was an entry dated May 10, 1959, just 2 days before the letter was postmarked. The entry read, "I can't sleep. The weight of what happened to Rick is crushing me. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I was protecting Ellen and the baby, but now I'm not so sure. If anyone finds out, it will destroy us. Asterisk, my heart was racing as I read the words. What had my grandfather done? Piecing together the clues, I started to form a theory. Around the time of Richard's disappearance, my grandparents were newly married, and my mom was just a baby. I suspected that whatever happened to Richard had something to do with protecting my grandmother and their young family. Through more digging, I eventually uncovered the truth. Richard and my grandfather had gotten into a heated argument one night. According to a letter from a surviving witness, the fight turned physical, and Richard fell, hitting his head on a rock. Panicked, my grandfather had hidden the body and covered up the accident, fearing the consequences. The guilt clearly haunted him for the rest of his life. He had buried the secret, literally and figuratively, to protect his family. I was left with a difficult decision. Should I report what I'd found to the authorities or let the past stay buried? After a lot of soul-searching, I decided to come forward. Richard's family deserved closure, even if it meant tarnishing my grandfather's memory. The police reopened the case, and with the evidence I provided, they were able to locate Richard's remains. The truth finally came out, and while it was painful, it also brought a sense of resolution. Looking back, I still grapple with mixed emotions about what I uncovered. My grandfather was a good man in so many ways, but he made a terrible mistake. Still, I believe facing the truth was the right thing to do. Sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried, and maybe that's a good thing. Second story. I was broke. Not the kind of broke where you have to skip coffee runs and weekend outings, but the kind of broke where you count quarters to pay for gas and live on ramen noodles for weeks. After losing my job in the city due to a company downsizing, I spent months applying for everything from marketing roles to janitorial positions, with no luck. My savings dwindled to almost nothing, and desperation was clawing at me. That's when I came across a job listing for a project coordinator in a small town about 3 hours away. The pay wasn't great, but it came with free housing, a small studio apartment above the office. That alone was enough to make me apply. A week later, I was hired over the phone. No interview, no background check, just a warm welcome aboard from the town manager, a man named Carl. When I arrived, the town of Evercrest felt like something out of a postcard. Quaint brick buildings lined the main street, and everyone seemed to know each other. Carl greeted me with a firm handshake and a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're gonna love it here," he said. "We're like one big family." My job was straightforward. I was tasked with coordinating a new community project, a public park that the town had been planning for years. The funding had finally come through, and construction was set to begin in a month. My role was to liaise with contractors, keep track of budgets, and ensure everything stayed on schedule. It seemed simple enough, but from day one, things felt off. For starters, the office was eerily quiet. Aside from Carl and me, there were only 2 other employees, Susan, the receptionist, and Mike, the town accountant. Both seemed friendly but guarded, like they were walking on eggshells. Then there were the documents. Carl handed me a thick folder of paperwork related to the park project, but a lot of it didn't make sense. Invoices didn't match up, and some of the contractors listed had no contact information. When I asked Carl about it, he waved me off. "Don't worry about the details," he said. "Just focus on keeping things moving." Red flags were everywhere, but I was too desperate to walk away. As the weeks went by, I started noticing more inconsistencies. Payments were being made to companies I couldn't verify, and the construction schedule kept getting pushed back for vague reasons. Every time I brought up a concern, Carl would pat me on the back and say, "You're doing great, kid." One evening, while going through old files in the office, I stumbled upon a folder labeled Confidential. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside were emails between Carl and several contractors, discussing inflated invoices and kickbacks. My stomach dropped. It was clear that Carl was skimming money from the project, funneling it through fake companies, and pocketing the difference. I didn't know what to do. If I confronted him, I risked losing my job and my only source of income. But if I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in his scheme. After a sleepless night, I decided to confide in Susan. She had worked at the office for years and seemed like someone I could trust. When I showed her the emails, her face turned pale. I knew something was wrong, she whispered. But I never had proof. Together, we devised a plan. Susan had a friend who worked as a journalist for a regional newspaper. We decided to leak the documents anonymously, hoping that an investigation would force Carl to face the consequences. The next few weeks were tense. I continued working as if nothing had happened, all the while waiting for the story to break. When it finally did, it hit the town like a bombshell. The article exposed Carl's embezzlement scheme in detail, citing the leaked emails as evidence. Within days, state auditors descended on Evercrest, and Carl was placed under investigation. But the fallout didn't end there. As the auditors dug deeper, they uncovered a web of corruption that went beyond Carl. Several town officials were implicated in the scheme, and the entire administration was thrown into chaos. For a while, I was terrified that someone would trace the leak back to me. But Susan and I had covered our tracks well, and no one ever suspected us. With Carl gone, the town hired a new manager and started rebuilding its reputation. The park project was put on hold temporarily, but eventually, it resumed under new leadership. As for me, I decided it was time to move on. The experience had left me shaken, but it also taught me the value of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I left Evercrest with little more than a suitcase and a story I'll never forget. It wasn't the fresh start I had envisioned, but in the end, it was exactly what I needed. Third story. I never knew much about my neighbor, Mr. Adler. He lived in the apartment directly across from mine, and while I'd occasionally see him shuffling to the mailboxes in his worn-out slippers, we'd exchanged no more than a handful of words in the 2 years I'd lived there. He was an older man, likely in his late 60s, with a perpetual scowl and a knack for avoiding eye contact. It wasn't until he disappeared that I realized how little anyone else knew about him either. The morning it all began was unremarkable. I'd just returned from my overnight shift at the hospital and was unlocking my door when I noticed something unusual, a note taped to Mr. Adler's door. It was written in blocky, uneven handwriting, *, do not enter. Contact, a number I didn't recognize. * curiosity got the better of me, and I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but all I got in return was silence. His old sedan was still in the parking lot, but his blinds were drawn tightly shut, as always. I called the number on the note. A man with a gruff voice answered, identifying himself as Elliot. When I explained why I was calling, there was a long pause before he muttered something about being out of town and hung up. That should have been the end of it, but something about the whole situation gnawed at me. Adler was the epitome of routine. Every Tuesday, he bought groceries. Every Friday, he watered the plants on his balcony. But his plants were wilting, and Tuesday had come and gone without a grocery trip. A few days later, I found a second note. This time, it was tucked under my own door, *, you'll need to look closer. * there was no signature, but the handwriting matched the first note. It was unsettling, to say the least. I debated ignoring it, but my curiosity had morphed into something more, a nagging sense of responsibility. I started asking around. Most of my neighbors either hadn't noticed Adler's absence or didn't care. One woman, Mrs. Trujillo, told me she thought he had a daughter somewhere in the Midwest, but wasn't sure. It wasn't much to go on, but it was better than nothing. A week after the second note, I noticed something else odd. On Adler's balcony, behind the wilting ferns, was a small wooden box. It hadn't been there before, and it was too conspicuous to ignore. I hesitated for a long time before climbing onto the railing of my own balcony and carefully stepping across the narrow gap to Adler's. The box was unlocked, and inside, I found a single photograph. It was old and faded, showing a younger Adler standing next to a woman and a little girl. Scrawled on the back were the words, Mara, 1987. Protect her. The name didn't ring any bells, but it was clear that whoever Mara was, she mattered deeply to Adler. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. I combed through public records, searched for obituaries, and even reached out to Elliot again, though he didn't pick up. Eventually, I found a newspaper clipping online about a missing person from 1987, Mara Adler, age 7. She had disappeared from a park in Chicago while playing with her mother. The more I uncovered, the darker the story became. Adler's wife had died by suicide a year after Mara vanished, and he'd moved across the country shortly after. No one had ever been charged in Mara's disappearance, and the case went cold. The pieces started falling into place. The cryptic notes, the photograph, it was as if Adler was trying to tell me something without saying it outright. But why me? A breakthrough came when I discovered a third note. This one slipped into my mailbox. Check the basement. I didn't even know our apartment complex had a basement. After some searching, I found a small, padlocked door in the laundry room. The lock was old and rusted, and a bit of force was all it took to snap it open. Inside, the basement was musty and cluttered with forgotten furniture and boxes. In the far corner, I found an old, locked trunk. With the help of a screwdriver, I pried it open. What I found inside still haunts me: journals, photographs, and newspaper clippings detailing not just Mara's disappearance, but several other missing children from the late 80s and early 90s. Many of the articles mentioned a man named James Whitaker, a convicted felon who had been a suspect in several cases but was never charged. There was also a map of our town, with several locations circled in red. I took the evidence to the local police. At first, they were skeptical, but as they began cross-referencing the information, they realized Adler had been quietly investigating these cases for decades. The investigation that followed led to a shocking discovery: James Whitaker had been living under an alias in a nearby town. The police arrested him, and though he denied everything, DNA evidence linked him to at least 2 of the missing children. As for Adler, he never returned. I later learned that he had checked into a hospital in another state, where he passed away from complications of untreated diabetes. I never got to ask him why he chose me to carry on his mission, but I like to think it's because he saw something in me, a willingness to act, even when it was easier not to. The park across the street from our complex has since been renamed Mara's Garden, a tribute to the little girl whose disappearance set everything in motion. I still think about Adler every time I see it. In life, he was a recluse, burdened by tragedy. But in death, he became something more, a man who refused to give up, even when everyone else had.